So I wanted to start here with a quote from Samuel Howe's Commission About Idiocy in Massachusetts, published in 1848. Class of people is always a burden upon the public. This class refers to the idiots, as they were called at the time. There are at least 1,000 persons of this class who not only contribute nothing to the common stock, but who are ravenous consumers, who are idle and often mischievous, and who are dead weights upon the material prosperity of the state. Dead weights on the material prosperity of the state. Now, the reason why I choose to start with this quote is not to suggest that we are dealing with exactly the same thing today, or that the current government are of the same moral fiber as Professor Howe's commission. It is rather an introductory reminder. Throughout history, questions of costs, of expenditure, of fiscal matters have been central in discussions about government and disability. Economic considerations was central at the time of the emergence of what we today call disability politics, and economic considerations were primary reason why we started to classify disability and why psychological and medical research into its nature and causes took off about 120 years ago. I do think that this is important to remember, so that we not get too caught up in the complexities and details of our present times. So, personal assistance in Sweden is, as we just heard, a service where each individual is free to decide who provides the service and how the assistance hours are used, at least in theory. That's how it's supposed to work. It was legislated in 1993, and it was very clear at the time that this was a question of human rights rather than costs. Now, since the Social Democratic government took office 3 years ago, about 2,000 persons have lost their assistance. Some of these now live in group homes, others are restricted to services in their homes, which may mean that they cannot work or use their leisure time freely. People have been forced to quit their jobs, suspending their political and civil society engagements, and others are thrown into social isolation. Disabled children are increasingly being cared for by their parents, which need to work part-time or not work at all. Some municipality governments are right now building orphanages and more group homes. Since disability politics became an established field of government, a branch of government, this is probably the biggest backlash that we have seen, I would say. At the same time, of course, the Swedish state budget is showing a surplus of about 60 billion Swedish crowns, which our Minister of Finance never fails to point out. What is interesting here is that these things are happening despite that precisely every actor, every political party claim that they are defending personal assistance. There is no political force today that is prepared to say that they want to save money on personal assistance, and the rather dramatic developments that we have seen in the last decade and that have accelerated in the last 3 years have all been accomplished without any parliamentary decisions and without any legislative changes. When faced with the question why this is happening, all relevant actors point elsewhere. The government stressed that they have not changed the law. The Swedish Social Insurance Agency, Försäkringskassan, or the SSIA, say that they just implement the existing legislation as interpreted through prejudicial court cases, and the judges that are responsible for these rulings imply that the SSIA are misinterpreting their rulings. This results in a situation, of course, where it's virtually impossible to hold anyone democratically accountable. Nobody wants to save money. Nobody has saved money, but nevertheless, money is saved with often detrimental consequences for personal assistance users. This leads to the question, how come a service that everybody appears to like and that has not been subject to legislative changes nevertheless is scaled down on? And what I will argue here is that what we need to do is to understand the complex interplay between these actors, that there is governance going on, although not by traditional or formal means. And by suspending the hunt for one guilty actor that we can blame and instead pay attention to the interplay, it becomes possible to fill this gap of accountability at the center of the personal assistance debate. I want to start by saying a few things about how the government, or current government, has acted. And I want to stress here that I speak about the development up until the new minister was appointed a few months ago. So my critique here is directed against the department under Åsa Regnér. First of all, since 2009, the Swedish High Court of Public Administration have ruled in 5 cases, and these court rulings have been interpreted by the SIA in ways that restrict what personal assistance hours can be granted. And I'm not an expert on the legal standings and of these rulings, and will not say anything or not so much about them here. However, I will come back to the fact that how they are interpreted by the SIA is of utmost importance. If we instead look at our government and start by considering how they respond to critique. Their line of argument right now is that this government has not acted to restrict the legal right to personal assistance. And we hear this on a weekly basis now, as soon as anyone tries to point out that horrible things are happening within this service in Sweden. And so the sentiment here is that they have nothing to do with the developments, and everything that has happened that is bad is purely a result of court rulings. And in fact, their idea has never been to save money at all. And this is quite far, I would argue, from what has actually happened. First, out of the 5 court rulings that restricts the number of people eligible for personal assistance, the government has only acted to reverse 1, and that was only after it became clear that the court ruling would effectively mean that up to half of all personal assistance users would not be eligible for the service, and after a massive storm of critique from the disability movement and from the political opposition. Now, if this situation is only a result of the High Court rulings, this of course begs the question why the government has not acted to reverse the other court rulings. The choice not to act is also a way of doing politics, and as it appears, there has not been a great need to restrict the legal right to personal assistance, since the interpretation of the High Court cases by the SIA have made these restrictions anyway. Not clarifying and reversing the law must certainly be interpreted as a satisfied nod with the implications. Aside from sitting back, the government has also used a number of informal means of government. Not directly affecting the legislation, but nevertheless affecting who gets personal assistance. In their communication, the Social Democrats have worked really hard to establish the idea that personal assistance is ridden with benefit frauds and overuse. In fact, in my review of everything that the current government has written or said about personal assistance, it shows that references to benefit frauds and cheaters are made in every single piece of writing or speaking. Here, a number of public commissions about benefit frauds have served the government really well. We have 3 major public commissions that have showed that about 10% of all public personal assistance payments are incorrect. And in our literature review of the method used, called the expert elicitation method, we conclude first that this method not is designed to tackle these kinds of questions and never before has been used to answer a social scientific question at all. It is a method developed to measure evacuation zones after nuclear disasters, for example, that is now being used to estimate the level of benefit frauds. Secondly, we conclude that the Swedish commissions completely breaks with more or less every methodological recommendation for how this method is supposed to be used. This leads us to the conclusion that those responsible either haven't read the research about how expert elicitation should be conducted or simply disregarded it. So, despite the conspicuous lack of solid evidence for the number 10% of all personal assistance payments are incorrect, this number has continued to frame the debate and very much set the parameters for what can be said about the service and what is seen as the problems that we have to tackle. Now, the recurrent hints that rising costs of personal assistance are the results of benefit cheaters have been used to justify efforts to reduce costs. Instead of changing the law, the government has steered the SIA in 2016, assigning this public agency to reduce the number of granted assistance hours. This resulted in an immediate upturn in rejected applications for personal assistance, and as a result, several billion Swedish crowns were saved as compared to predicted expenditure. Furthermore, we are all waiting for the public commission examining, or the LSS-utredning, which will deliver a set of proposals for how to reform disability services in October this year. So what we see here is that despite describing themselves as defenders of personal assistance, it is clear that our current government has taken action to cut back on personal assistance costs, repeatedly claiming furthermore that this is necessary to defend the legitimacy of the service. If costs continue to rise, the legitimacy of personal assistance will erode, the argument goes, which means that austerity measures and cutbacks can be framed as a way of defending personal assistance. However, the questioning of the legitimacy of personal assistance is in fact instigated and driven by government rhetoric. So rather than a legitimacy crisis that the Social Democrats respond to, I argue that what we see here is that the government actively work to create a legitimacy crisis that they in turn can refer to justify cutbacks. Finally, it is absolutely clear that the measures taken by the government is not designed to come to terms with the problems they describe. Commissioning, the SSIA to grant fewer hours generally is not an efficient means to come to terms with benefit frauds. So rather than the Social Democrats responding to the problem with welfare fraud, I argue that what we see here is a general cutbacks, saving money irrespective of how, and then trying to legitimize this by referring to benefit frauds. How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Do I have 3 minutes? Okay, I need to hurry up. The SSIA, on the other hand, is arguing that they are merely following the law, that they are prohibited from being involved in policy development, so they are merely implementing policy here. Also, this can, of course, be questioned. In actual fact, the key component, I argue, of the Swedish version of austerity is the willingness of the SIA to fulfill the government wishes, well beyond, I would say, what can be expected, provided the Swedish constitution of independent public agencies. I wrote a debate article in Dagens Nyheter, a big Swedish daily, criticizing the Swedish government. Surprisingly, this article was not responded to by any government representative, but by the head of the SIA, which of course begs the question why it should be the job of a public agency to defend the government. And if you study, I mean, the rhetorics of the SIA, you can see that they very closely follow how the government frame and pitch and talk about personal assistance. But the influence of the SIA is not only about discourse, about rhetorics, but also about how they continuously seem to interpret the law and the prejudicial court cases as hard and as strictly as possible. And we could really see this after the SIA was commissioned to cut down on granted assistance hours in 2016, where they reinterpreted a court case from 2012, which all of a sudden and out of nowhere was used as a means to reject applications for personal assistance. So what I argue is that we see this interplay between these different bodies of government. And it is in the interplay between these that, and if you start to untangle their relationships, that you can see the rationality behind the politics and understand the development. And yeah, I guess my time is up.